Yes.
Thank you. Before we pick up, Professor Barbara, the three final topics I want to discuss with you, we were discussing earlier today various matters addressing sensitivity and specificity of the testing. And I've just been asked to highlight that Professor Barbara's witness statement deals with the scientific details of that to quite a considerable extent. I'm not going to take him to it, but just to highlight for core participants that it's there in his statement.
Yes, thank you.
The first matter, Professor Barbara, I want to ask you about, it relates to hepatitis B core antibody testing, not as a surrogate test for hepatitis C, but in the context of a study that was being undertaken in relation to its use to reduce hepatitis B transmission. Firstly, were you aware of that study taking place in the early 1990s?
Sorry, to reduce the risk of hepatitis B.
That's right.
There were lots of studies in that regard, and I was certainly very interested in the idea of anti-HBC to detect what I call tail-end carriers who were at the end of carriage but might have some residual infectivity, especially in the large volume of a donation.
Can we turn then to DHSC 304709_153, please?
You forgive me if I have this heated wheat bag on my neck. I've developed a very stiff neck.
Of course. We have a letter here from Harold Gunson, dated the 7th of October 1993, sent to all RTD's chief executives about anti-HBC testing of blood donations. And it addresses the decision of the MSBT not to pursue routine testing of all blood donations for anti-HBC. The letter then says this decision was reached after consideration of the following. 1, all ELISA tests for anti-HBC gave false positive results. Even the more specific tests, the false positivity rate appeared to be in the order of tenfold. 2, there were no agreed satisfactory confirmatory tests, which means that there will be an inability to provide definitive health information to a considerable number of donors. A question arose in earlier inquiry hearings about this point. If there were no confirmatory tests, how could it be known that the ELISA tests gave false positive results? Is that something you can assist us with?
Yes, I have written an email to the solicitors helping me, Vicky Morris, and I believe they were trying to get this through to Sir Brian.
Perhaps you can just explain for us now, verbally if you can, how it comes to be said that you have false positives without a confirmatory test.
Yes, there is no single confirmatory test for anti-HBC, and laboratories working on this would have had access to a battery of tests. They would have initially tried to detect any HBsAg with as sensitive a test as possible, which eventually, of course, became PCR. They would also titrate the anti-HBC to see how strong the reaction was. And of course, the stronger reactions were more likely to be real. They could then also test for anti-HBs, because the presence of anti-HBC could either reflect continuing infectivity with undetectable HBsAg, or it could reflect clearance of virus with undetectable anti-HBs. But if an anti-HBC positive donor had anti-HBs at a level of 20 milli-IUs per ml, that would be considered protective or immune, and it would also, of course, confirm the anti-HBC result. You could also test for this other marker, anti-HBe, which is E antigen, is part of the different antigens in Hep B, and E antigen is associated with the icosahedral virus, with the core of the icosahedral core. And because it's associated with the virus, it's also associated with infectivity. And anti-HBe is what develops when the virus is cleared. So with this range, this battery of tests, you could get a pretty good idea if an anticore reaction was real. Now, of course, you couldn't do this in a routine setting because it's not a single confirmatory test. And indeed, for research purposes, you could even ask the anticore positive individual if they'd agree to be vaccinated when Hep B vaccine became available. And if there was undetectable anti-HBs, that would, of course, have been boosted. So it was this battery of laboratory and almost research tests that could give us the handle on what was real or not.
Thank you. The second topic I want to discuss with you is...
Can I just summarise, so that the sake of perhaps understanding of those who may not have had the advantage of reading your statement first, in which you set out quite a bit of this. What I think you've said, but tell me if I've got it wrong, is that there wasn't a single test that you could use, i.e. as a confirmatory test, but there were a number of different tests which shone a light upon different aspects of it together. If you use those tests, you could say with a fair degree of certainty you have got the virus or the antibody.
That's absolutely right, Sir Brian, yeah.
Thank you.
Moving on then, Professor Barbara, to my second topic. You've said in your statement that you built and maintained relationships with the manufacturers and suppliers of test kits. Can you help us with what that involved? How you built and maintained those relationships?
Well, of course, for hepatitis C, because I could identify some donors who were very likely to have transmitted non-A, non-B, and we detected that through surrogate testing, the fact that they came up in at least one, sometimes two post-transfusion non-A, non-Bs. We saw that paper about a donor implicated twice. We were able to provide plasma to Professor Richard Tedder, and working with Wellcome Laboratories, as they were then, they produced an independent British clone. So that was a close working relationship with a commercial company. Then for enhancement of tests, for tweaking of tests, for any feedback that we could give to manufacturers to make tests better, easier, quicker, we would certainly want to do that. And I also got companies to put in reagents to show us when a serum sample had been added to a diluent. For a surface antigen test, you just added undiluted serum and you could clearly see the sample in the microplate well. But when you were adding, say, 10 microliters of serum sample to 100 microliters of diluent, you couldn't be sure that you'd added that. And manufacturers developed, they tweaked their assays so they could add chemical reagents that didn't affect the test, but that changed color when you added sample. And also they added color to all the other reagents so that you could tell that you performed each stage, the 5 stages or so of an ELISA assay. So the relationship, I never thought of them and us. I always felt that we were working together, and the more help we gave them, the better the test would be, to enhance patient safety.
Can I turn now to a letter, SBTS 5067 _ 087. It's a letter written by John Cash to Harold Gunson, dated the 7th of September 1992. And the substance of the letter reads as follows. As a consequence of a number of consultations over the last months, it's clear to me that throughout the UK BTS, and perhaps beyond, there is growing concern that there may have emerged a small cartel which is manipulating the development of microbiology donation screening test evaluation, and to some extent confirmation testing. This manipulation is perceived to be directed towards the personal research interests of Dr. Barbara, Professor Tedder and Dr. Mortimer, and not necessarily the best interests of the UK BTS. More recently, concern has been expressed that some or all of these individuals may be inappropriately associated with certain commercial manufacturers of microbiology donation test kits, such that their professional advice is being influenced by the interests of the commercial organisations with which they are associated. These are weighty matters and of a very serious nature, and I'm bound to advise you that very recent events have led me to share many of these concerns. Then over the page. It's my earnest hope that as we move forward to an NBA, that the concerns expressed above can be appropriately dealt with. First of all, were you aware of this letter at the time or shortly after?
No.
And were the concerns...
No, Harold Gunson never showed it to me, never brought the issue up.
And that was my next question. Did he raise any of the concerns that are written in this letter?
No, and with all due respect to the late Professor Cash, I think Harold thought they were rubbish. I can honestly say they were totally unfounded. Myself and the colleagues mentioned there did indeed work with manufacturers for the reasons that I've already said. As a patent holder, as a co-patent holder for hepatitis C, I never received any of the royalty monies. They went to the centre, actually into my laboratory, to purchase enhanced bacteriology screening tests, which eventually became the basis of our bacteriology reference work. It's also of interest, I can't remember when, but Professor Cash offered me the job of running the Scottish National Micro Lab. Without interview, it was just a straight offer. So I don't think he could have thought too ill of me. But when I saw this first, it came as a total surprise and totally unfounded as well. Sorry if I'm a bit passionate about that.
I want to then move to my last topic, Professor Barbara, and that is in relation to organisational matters across the blood transfusion service. In your statement, you've said that you feel that the North London Centre was sometimes held back by slower centres. Can you help us with what you were referring to there?
I think sometimes we had developed initiatives and ideas like, for example, the AIDS questionnaire or the self-exclusion questionnaire, which we thought were very relevant and significant. And I think other centres felt we were being over the top and being too intrusive. And there were issues like this where we might have wanted to introduce concepts, set up national registers, which sometimes we got some resistance about.
Was your perception that that slowness changed, either for better or worse, when the National Directorate was set up?
I think all I can say there is when the National Directorate was set up, we had at least got a unified service that, if you like, was all singing to the same hymn sheet. So I think that provided that we had the platform to put our ideas forward, they could be considered nationally, and if it was felt there was something relevant, then that could be initiated. So I think it probably helped.
You've also said in your statement that you think there was a gradual drift in attitude and direction towards a more precautionary approach, and you used the word drift rather than shift.
Yes.
Why was that? Why did you feel it was a drift rather than a shift?
Well, if you use those words in relation to the evolution of flu variants, year by year you get slight changes, and that's a drift. Every now and again you get a massive change, and that's a shift. So I don't think there was an immediate massive change. I think that as a growing awareness of the relevance of transfusion-transmitted infections that came about, for example, with the development of SHOT and the better reporting of from hospitals of transfusion infections, I think people became aware that one needed to do as much as one reasonably could to prevent or reduce the risk from transfusion infections. With the advent of variant CJD and the precautionary principle as espoused by Mr. Frank Dobson, who was Secretary for Health, when he came to talk to us at a British Blood Transfusion Society annual meeting, he basically was saying that the precautionary principle ruled, and with the interventions for variant CJD, then you'll be able to see that if anything was thought that it might help, it was introduced.
Given the enormity of the AIDS crisis, why did a shift in attitude not take place at an earlier date from your perspective?
In relation to HIV?
Why did that not mark? Yes, in relation to HIV, why did that not mark a point when a shift in attitude and direction took place?
I think in large part because it took us quite a while to perceive just how uniformly devastating an HIV infection was. Because, as I said before, it could take years before immune deficiency developed and before that showed itself as opportunistic infections, often very horrible, very aggressive Kaposi sarcoma, cytomegalovirus, otherwise very mild, that would prove fatal, toxoplasmosis. And I think it took quite a while to understand that HIV was not just horrible in certain cases, but it was uniformly devastating.
So those are the questions I have for Professor Barbara. I've had some questions already from recognised legal representatives, but I'm conscious that we should take a break to allow them to send in any further questions.
Yes, do you have any sense of how long you might need?
I think only 10 minutes, sir.
Okay, well let's then take a quarter of an hour.
Thank you.
and come back at 2:45. Professor, what happens? Forgive me for talking with my mask. What happens now is that core participants whose representatives have been listening to what you've said so far may have questions which they want to put to you. And they put those through counsel. She must first of all obviously be told what those questions are, and that's what this next period will give a chance to happen. So we'll come back at 2:45. I can't tell you quite how long you'll be. It could be very short, it could be quite a long time. It all depends how many questions there are, of course. But 2:45.
Could I just interrupt, Sir Brian?
Yes, certainly.
You raised the interesting question, which I sort of paraphrased as, if we had introduced first generation anti-HCV ELISAs, would we have lost any more blood or donors and caused ourselves any more problem than if we'd introduced surrogate testing? And looking back at my very brief notes, depending on where you set cutoffs for raised ALT and anti-HBC, and if we were to use both those markers, I think we'd have probably had less of a problem with first generation anti-HCV. But that wasn't a question that had arisen before. So it certainly is an interesting point. And the other thing I remembered was that actually, if you had taken appropriate cutoffs for ALT and anti-core and excluded donors who were both, only excluded donors who were both anti-HCV, COS and ALT raised, you were approaching the predictive value of real infectivity as you did with the first generation anti-HCV ELISAs. So in retrospect, and with the benefits of hindsight, these are points that do prove indeed very interesting. So yes, thank you for bringing those up.
Well, thank you for that answer. It confirms what I suspected may be the case, but I'm not qualified to know. This is why I asked you. So thank you for that. That's fascinating. I shall have to work out what I make of the implications of that answer, but it's thank you for it. 2:45.
Thank you.
2:45. Thank you.